welcome and good morning. Thank you for attending another wonderful Fresno Master Gardener program. My name is Laura Fleek. I am an adult programming librarian with Fresno County, working out of the Woodward Park branch. I want to let everyone know that we are recording this program and it will be posted to the Fresno County Library YouTube website as well as the Fresno Master Gardeners website. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A button throughout the program. I'll be keeping track. Ann is happy to take all your questions at the end of her presentation. Please welcome Ann Edahl back for another wonderful program today. Welcome, Ann.
Thanks, Laura. Today I'm going to be talking about gardening with herbs, what to do with the herbs after you harvest them, and why it's great to be gardening with herbs, especially in our county during this drought. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from the Midwest. I've spent most of my life there. I've been in Fresno since 2013, Master Gardener since 2017. At the very end of this program, we're going to give you some information about how you too can become a Master Gardener. And I love all sorts of gardening, especially gardening with drought-tolerant plants. What I wanted to do before I get into my actual program, because as you all know, we're in a terrible drought situation right now that doesn't seem to have an end in sight. So we wanted to give you just a few things that you can do right now to help conserve water in your landscape. So we have just 10 items here. I'm just going to go through them really quickly. Some of them are we're going to see me talking about them again during the program itself because many herbs are drought tolerant. So first, you want to select plants appropriate for your zone. In Fresno, that's zone 8 or 9. Really briefly, you can Google this, but we're talking here about the USDA plant hardiness zone. And that's basically, we're saying, how hot a plant can handle, and then how cold a plant can handle in the winter, sorry. There's other things that go into a zone. And usually when you're buying a plant, it's going to tell you right there what zone it's appropriate for. If you're going to a garden center here in Fresno County, they're pretty good at only selling plants that are appropriate for our zone, but it doesn't hurt to check, Google something if you're not certain. Mulching is crucial to keep that moisture in. Once you've irrigated, if you're not careful, that water is just going to evaporate right out. If you add mulch, we suggest 3 to 6 inches, but any amount of mulch will do. It's going to help keep that moisture in, and it's also going to help, especially in summer, regulate the temperature. The soil won't get as hot. Control weeds. Here, what we're talking about is weeds are competing with the water, for the water with your plants that you want to be there. So control those weeds and allow the plants that are in your landscape to get the water that you're using. Watering in the AM is crucial. If you water in the heat of the day, a lot of that water just evaporates. If you've ever tried it, you can just see that water spray just go up in the air. That's not helping your plants. So water in the AM. Grouping plants with similar water needs together means that you're not watering, say, a sage plant that doesn't need much water with more water than it needs. The 6th tip is to water deeply and less often. Perennial plants, trees, shrubs, you want to water them so they get the water gets all the way down to the roots of the established plant. Dry them out between waterings, and then you won't have to water as often. Mixing soil amendments into the soil will also help keep that moisture in. The easiest soil amendment I think of is compost. That's a whole different class, but compost makes a great soil amendment. You're getting organic matter in there. Not now, but soon, if you can replace your lawn with drought-tolerant plants, that's really going to help. You don't have to do it all at once. I have a pretty big lawn out front, and I'm just little by little chipping away at replacing that lawn with drought-tolerant plants. In my case, I plant a lot of native plants. Those are that are drought tolerant. Avoid over fertilizing. That does nobody any good. And then sweep your walkways and driveways. Don't hose them. That's just kind of a waste of water. Water's not going to go anywhere helpful. So sweep, don't hose. All right, so think about that. Do what you can to help, and let's get right into the herb presentation. So when we're talking about herbs, the first thing we want to think about is what kind of herbs there are. Well, we can talk about the life cycle of the herb. Some herbs are annual. That means they're only going to be there for a year and then they die or they need to be replaced. They're biennial. That means they'll last 2 years, bi for 2. Parsley is an example of that. It means that first year it's growing and the second year it goes to seed and then it dies. And the perennials, these are going to last multi-year. Oregano is a great example of an herb like that. Or you think about the size of herbs. Small plants, thyme plants are quite small. Nasturtiums are an herb. Somebody asked last time I taught this, nasturtiums are herbs. Yes, you can eat both the flower and the leaf of a nasturtium. Many of them are vines. And then shrub, those are going to be larger. Rosemary in this area is a great example of a shrub. In other parts of the United States, it's actually a tender perennial and never gets that big. But here you can actually use it as a shrub. And then tree, the bay is the most around here, the best example of a tree that's an herb. Think about when you put that in stew. And the bay is actually a native to this area. So that's a great tree to plant. And then you think about leaves. Are they evergreen leaves? Are they deciduous, meaning do they lose their leaves in the winter? And then we think about the uses for herbs. Now, looking ahead tip, we're actually going to look just mainly at the culinary herbs today. But culinary, historically, that's a great use of herbs. Cooking, baking, putting them in salads, adding herbs to your tea to add a different flavor. Crafts, for example, greeting cards, you might dry the herbs and use them to create greeting cards or other types of crafts. I am not a crafter, so I'm sure if you are, you can come up with some great ideas. The scent, maybe not for cooking, but in soaps, lavender is used for lots of soap making. Sachets, put them in your drawer to make it smell nice. And then medicinal, probably the most common example of that is aloe vera. People they cut the leaf off and they use the goo, we'll just call it inside, the non-technical term, for light burns. Nothing, if you have a strong burn, don't use that, but if it's just a little light burn. And then in the landscape, maybe you're not going to use it for culinary craft or these other items, but you're going to use it throughout the landscape. And there's very different ways you can incorporate herbs into any style, whether it's a formal garden, informal, whether edging, maybe you have a kitchen garden for ground cover, and then really important these days, growing it for beneficials. We want to get those bees, moths, other things that are pollinators, really crucial that we keep the pollinators around and happy. So here's some perennial herbs. If you can read this, if I have D there, drought tolerant, many herbs are drought tolerant, and some, just thinking ahead, some, even if I don't mark them as drought tolerant, they may do fairly well during this drought. I is invasive, so you want to be really careful about how you use those. And P means that it does particularly well in part shade. Thyme covers all those marks. It's drought tolerant and it's okay in part shade. Oregano, also drought tolerant. Oregano, and I say / sweet marjoram. Oregano and sweet marjoram come from the same genus. So the warning here is when you're going to buy your herbs, if it says oreganum on it with italics, that's the scientific name genus. Both oregano and sweet marjoram are the same genus, but they taste completely different. So you may want to just take your fingers, rub against that leaf, smell it, make sure that's the oregano or the sweet marjoram. Sweet marjoram is much milder, and so you're buying the one that you want. Rosemary, another great, it's a Mediterranean plant, so it's very drought tolerant. It comes in various sizes, the shrub size, it comes in trailing rosemary, so it'll be lower to the ground. It's a really great plant for this area. Culinary sage also does pretty okay in part shade. That's where I have my culinary sage. That's the one you're going to use dry and use in your turkey stuffing Thanksgiving. Tarragon, if some of you don't know about tarragon, it's kind of a licoricey taste. It's very common in cooking with fish or chicken, very drought tolerant. And I should have added here, it's French tarragon we're talking about. If you see something called Russian tarragon, that's pretty flavorous. It's kind of like cooking with grass. So again, this is one you're going to want to, if you see it in the store, just take a moment, rub against leaves with your fingers, because that's going to release the essential oil in the leaf. Smell it and see if it's got that little licoricey flavor. Then you know you're getting the French tarragon. Winter savory, great for soups, very drought tolerant. It's not a common herb around here, but that's the fun about growing herbs. You can grow herbs that maybe are harder to find in the store or more expensive to find in the store. Chives do well here. They all, again, do well in part shade. I didn't put drought tolerant, but they can handle some drought. Some less watering. So you might want to try that. Lavenders, you see those all around Fresno because they do so well in Fresno. There's different types you'll see, and they're usually by country. Spanish, those are the, I don't have a picture here, but they're the usually two-toned. You can see those. They have a dark top and a lighter bottom on the flower. And then there's English, which you see the most of around here. And then the French lavender, you don't see as much of here, but that's the lavender you'd use if you're making soaps. It's the most pungent smell. It's beautiful. Mints are part shade, but they're also very invasive. So we're going to get to some slides about how to make sure the mint doesn't take over your garden. Lemon balm, it's also invasive. It's part of the mint family, a great one for tea. Catnip, invasive and part shade. Now, this is not to be confused with catmint. They are the same genus, but catnip is the one that cats go crazy over. It's a much taller plant. Catmint is a more tame plant, and it's much lower to the ground. Catnip can kind of go wild if your cats don't get to it first. But it could be fun to grow in a pot if you've got cats who love it. Fennel can also be used as an annual. It's a very tall perennial. Bay is that tree I was talking about earlier that does fairly well in part shade. It can be a very big tree though, so careful where you plant it if you get one that's going to grow very tall. Scented geraniums, if you've seen those around, you can use the flowers with cooking. Some people use it for baking, like decoration. I don't, but it makes a great plant in your landscape. And then Roman chamomile is a perennial herb. It's low growing. Some people have a hard time growing it here. I've had kind of luck. I put it in part shade. It doesn't really like our zone, but you can make it work. I don't water it any more than I water other things in my landscape. But just to be aware, this is not the chamomile that most people use for tea. Roman chamomile, think of that as a ground cover. German chamomile is the plant you want to grow if you want to grow tea. And we're going to get to that in another slide that's coming up. So here's an example of a scented geranium on the left and tarragon on the right. Tarragon doesn't actually bloom, so but it's got these lovely long, thin leaves. And you just would cut off the leaf, maybe a few right above another leaf pair, so you get as much as you need to use for your either drying or for the dish you're cooking tonight or baking with. And then it'll keep going, it'll keep growing back. So here's some annual and biennial herbs that are common around here. Again, P meaning part shade. Now, most annuals do need a little more water than the perennials do. So that's why I don't have any of these as drought tolerant, even though some could survive in drought. Parsley is probably one of the most common ones. As I said before, it's biennial. The first year is when you're going to want to use the parsley leaf. That second year is when it's going to shoot up with the flower and seed. It will reseed if it's happy where it is. You'll have a perennial parsley patch for your biennial. Basil, highly frost sensitive. So if you get a little bit of a frost here, your basil might not survive too long. But again, this one you're growing just for your leaves. One tip here, if you're growing basil, if it starts flowering, just pinch the flower off with your fingers, and then the more energy will go into the leaf, because that's what you're going to be using for your pesto, for your caprese salad, which I've been eating a ton of lately because it's no cook salad. But basil comes in all sorts of sizes and flavors even. You've got the regular basil, but then you've got like cinnamon flavored basil, you have lemon flavored basil. So I always say, try before you buy, see if it's what you want. Cilantro, another great one for here. It often reseeds, and I say cilantro, coriander. It, like dill, is one where you can use the leaves for one thing, and then if you let it go to seed and dry that seed, you use the seed for cooking. So the seed of cilantro is what we typically call coriander, and we refer to the leaves normally as cilantro. Dill, the same way. You can use the dill weed or dill leaves, fresh or dry, and then also use a dill seed. Many of you, if you pickle at all, you often use dill seed in your pickling. Here's that German chamomile I was talking about. It's a different genus. It grows tall. It's an annual. This is what you'd want to use. The flower of the German chamomile is what you want to use for tea. And then nasturtiums. Now around here, many nasturtiums are perennial, but in most areas of the country, it's an annual herb. And then borage. I put borage here because it's a beautiful plant, but it can reseed invasively. So be careful if you grow borage around here. But the leaves and the flowers taste kind of cucumbery. It's a really gentle, beautiful herb. Here's an example of the German chamomile on the left that's blooming. So you would pick those flowers and dry them for your tea. And then an example of that borage on the right, showing those beautiful blue flowers. All right, just a little bit on planting herbs. We're going to plant either indoors or outdoors. So for indoors, just like any good plant, you're planting indoors, you want to start with the good and appropriate potting soil, whether you're starting from seed or transplants. Good drainage is a must. Roots of any kind, they hate to be have too much moisture on the bottom just sticking there. So whatever you put it in your pot, make sure there's a drainage hole there, and then something to hold the runoff from the water when you're planting. Location. Best for herbs is south facing. Herbs want a minimum of 5 hours for the best results. If they get a little leggy when in your indoor pots, it means it's probably not getting enough sun. So maybe if you really want to grow herbs indoors, artificial light is an option. And both fluorescent and LED, this was a new thing I learned a few years ago. LED does work as an artificial light to grow plants. Incandescent light will not work to help grow inside. So just a few pictures of some idea, just to give you some ideas of how you can grow herbs inside. If you have a kitchen windowsill, here's some, I think we've got some basil there. I see there's some parsley sticking in one of those. Both of those make really good indoor plants, some thyme. Here's another example. They just have everything on a tray. This could be either fennel or dill on the far right back. There's some chives in there. You can see maybe they're not getting enough sun, but yeah, they'll be okay. You can get some, and maybe 1 or 2 bits of thyme way on the left. Front center looks like that's a basil, and then I'm not sure what that is in the front right. That could be an oregano. And then I keep this in because I just love the color. I just love lime green planters. So just another good idea. Again, basil doing really well inside. This what I think is probably a rosemary closer to you is going to outgrow its pot really quickly, but if you keep pruning it, harvesting it, it might be okay for a year or two in this pot, and then you're really going to have to repot it. And then this is just a warning. Put a tray underneath those pots, or else you're going to come back and be really sorry that you've got some cleanup and maybe rotted wood. So always use a tray underneath your pots. Wall herb gardens are pretty in right now. They were really in wall gardens for a while ago. I'm not sure they're as popular now, but you can either make one yourself, or you can go to lots of stores, online stores, and buy one. Here's a good example because you can tell that you're not going to have problems with watering. There's a pot inside each one of these metal containers. So it's the metal container that will catch the water as you're watering. But a good idea if you don't have a lot of space and you can still get some sunlight. Outdoor. So when you're going to plant some herbs outdoor, you want to prep the soil. Now for a lot of herbs, I'm going to say a majority of the herbs, you probably do not need to add organic matter. Perennial herbs are really quite happy and prefer soil that doesn't have too much organic matter added. You don't really want them to grow that fast. If it's a annual, however, maybe you have a plot of basil plants, you really are going to want to add that organic matter. That's what they're feeding off of, the plants. You can seed or transplant. Either works well. I usually use transplants because for seed, you can grow some of them right outdoors, but many you have to start the seed indoors first. And I got to be honest with you, I'm a lazy gardener, so I buy the transplants, or I divide what I already have, which is a different class, but you can divide plants and save a lot of money. Maybe you swap with your neighbor. Don't plant too deep. You don't want to plant any deeper than what the plant comes in its transplant container. Pull apart the roots just a little bit if they're root bound. Root bound meaning, are they circling around? You take it out of the container, you see a bunch of roots circling around or really matted on the bottom. Just gently pull the roots apart before you plant. And then here's that water-wise tip. Group by needs. So group by water needs. Don't put your basil plant, which needs a little more water, by your rosemary plant, which would be very happy with very little water throughout the summer. And then group by use. If you know you're gonna, maybe you love Italian cooking, so you're gonna put your oregano and your thyme and what else you cook with oregano. Actually, winter savory is good for Italian cooking. Put those together so it's really easy. You just go out there when you're going to cook with that and snip what you need and bring it back in. If you're going to plant in containers in the outdoor, the minimum that we recommend is a 6-inch diameter for them to be happy. How do you maintain once you've planted it? Water enough to water the entire root system when you are going to water. This way you're not, as we talked about with the drought slide, you're not going to have to water as often. Don't water just a little bit and think that's going to be enough. Then you're going to catch yourself watering more often than you need to. Annuals just don't have very deep roots, so you don't have to water annuals as much. They're shallow, whereas rosemary, for example, has very deep roots. How do you know if it's ready to water? The easiest, you can buy all sorts of techno items if you're into that. I just kind of use my finger, dig it down, see if it's dry. Know your soil type. This will help. This is for every kind of landscape. If it's clay, it holds water. You might not have to water as much. The easiest way, the non-scientific way, take a little bit. If you crush it in your hand, open it up, and it just keeps its shape like think of putty. It's probably very clayey. If you do that and it just completely falls apart, it's sandy and it's going to might need more water, especially in summer. You might, in that case, actually want to put compost in to amend that soil. And if it just kind of holds its shape, but not really, that's loamy. That's the best kind of soil you can have for any type. You're very lucky you've got loamy soil. Pruning. Prune for shape. Maybe you're using that rosemary for a hedge. You can just prune for shape. Deadhead, especially if you're using this for harvesting, for cooking, for other culinary purposes. It's going to encourage more blooms if you're looking for blooms. It's going to prevent, it's going to have more flavorful leaves if you get rid of the flowers, if you're going for if you want the leaf. So remove those splint flowers. If, on the other hand, you really want it for beneficials, then you can leave a lot of the flowers there to encourage the beneficials, those bees and other beneficial insects coming in. So how to harvest. For best flavor, you want to harvest right before they flower. Maybe you see the bud just forming. That's the time when all the essential oils are the highest in the leaves. If you wait till they flower, the energy is now going to the flower and not so much the leaves. They'll lose some flavor. And then pick early in the morning after the dew has dried, if you can, because that's also when the essential oils are the most concentrated. If you're going to harvest and you're not harvesting the whole plant, harvest above a set of leaves. I should have a slide for this. I'll add that next time. And you want to not take more than 3/4 of the plant. And that's going to allow the plant to flush and grow some more, and you'll have more herbs to harvest later in the season. So drying herbs. Drying herbs is a really common way to keep your herbs. You're going to want to gather them in bunches, tie them with a string. That's the most common way. If you want to, a lot of people recommend at that point putting a paper bag over that and also tying that with a string. And then you hang this upside down to dry. It's going to take about 2 weeks. Using a paper bag over the bundle will catch any leaves because as they dry, some of them might fall off. Less, I don't recommend it as much. It's going to be faster, but you have to be much more careful using the oven or even the microwave. Use a very low oven, stir occasionally. Microwave, I would just do 30 seconds at a time to see. If you do too much, you really are going to lose, it's going to dry too much and you'll lose the flavor if the oven or the microwave. Some of them actually do all right in the refrigerator, drying an herb refrigerator. Parsley especially works well that way. You just put it in a paper bag, check on it every few days to see how well it's doing. And then you can, it will dry in the refrigerator. Here's just a pretty example of somebody, this is more for aesthetic reasons, but they can certainly absolutely use those herbs after they've dried. They just have a beautiful area in their house that they can basically display their herbs as they're drying. So what are other ways to store your herbs? If you're storing, I'm going to jump down because we're just talking about dried herbs. If you are storing your dried herbs, store them if you can as whole leaves. If you're going to crumble them, do that right before you're going to use them for cooking or your other uses. That'll keep their flavor better. Store them in a cool, dry place in a glass container away from the sun. Fresh herbs, you can store those as sprigs in jars of water. As I said, I'm using a lot of basil lately in my salads in this hot weather. And I just keep a jar of basil on my counter. I make sure I put the water in every day or two and make sure there's enough. And it lasts a number of days. For longer periods, you can store them in the refrigerator. Fresh herbs and basil especially will last fairly long that way. Now, the fun part, adding herbs in your landscape. So you have to think about a lot of things. It isn't rocket science, and it's even if you make a mistake in gardening, think of that as a learning experience, and you can always move your herb if you want it in some other place. But before you plant, think about what kind of garden you do or what kind of garden you want. Do you want a formal garden? Just think symmetry. It's gonna be like looking in a mirror. Just think that's the easiest way of thinking of what a formal garden is. Or is it informal, more like the English cottage garden where you just it's more of a hodgepodge. There might be a method to your madness, but the whole effect is more informal. Do you love historical gardens? We're going to see a picture of what a knot garden is, which is really common in the medieval times as a way to grow herbs. Maybe you have a rock garden where you want to add some herbs to that. Do you want a dedicated herb garden? Do you want a kitchen garden? Maybe all you have room for, you want to add containers to your gardening. Herbs are really good for container gardening. And maybe there's a place where you want a ground cover. There's some herbs work really well for ground cover. Is your idea fragrance? Then you're going to want to think planting the herbs that appeal to you the most. And then last, but certainly not least, what we talked about before is your idea for beneficials. Are you more wanting to plant something in part of your garden just to bring those pollinators in? And some herbs, many herbs do well, but for example, you wouldn't want to plant tarragon there because it doesn't flower. Oregano, on the other hand, if you let that go to flower, which I do in part of my garden, the bees love it. So here's some inspiration for you. This is an example of a medieval garden that is in Germany. And here you can see they've got, it's a formal garden. They have paths. You can see where things are mirroring each other. Here's another medieval garden in Germany. Again, a formal garden with, you can see these paths that mirror each other. And then you can you have borders, and then you have different herbs that they plant within each one of those beds. I was talking about a knot garden. Here's a great example of a knot garden, Elizabethan knot garden. So that's late 16th, early 17th century is what we're talking about. This is a recreation of a knot garden that's actually in Richmond, Virginia. What you see here is overlapping interlocking shapes. That's the key for a knot garden. And then here you want to use herbs that have similar heights because you don't want one part of that knot to be much higher than the other part of the knot. And that will cut down on the amount of maintenance you have to do to keep this in shape. But really, if you've got the room and if you've got the time, this is a beautiful way to use herbs. Here's another example. This one is an example of a symmetrical herb garden. This one is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Here we have a very common setup for an herb garden. We have a circular center, and then think of the whole thing as a big square or a rectangle, and it's divided into 4 quarters. So a central circle. In this example, they've actually planted it with herbs, but maybe that's where your sundial goes, or in my garden, that's where my fountain goes. And then you've got quarters off of that are symmetrical with each other. But we don't all have room for all of these. So how about a more manageable herb garden? Here's a great example. This is an informal garden, a front yard herb garden. We've got some lavender right behind that little beehive. I don't think it's an active beehive, but a cloche, sorry. And then on the far left, we don't see it a lot here, but that's called monarda or bee balm. That's used, can be used in teas. We've got some chives. We've got some thyme. Just a really pleasant herb garden that doesn't need a lot of space. Here's a culinary herb garden in a circle form, which is pretty classic, a classic example of an herb garden. You put something taller in the middle, or maybe that's also where a fountain or a bird bath or your sundial goes. And then each different type of herb radiates out. You see in that bottom right, that's a nasturtium, and then different herbs going around that circle in a radius. Here's another example of a radial circle herb garden, this one using bricks to differentiate the different herbs, and an obelisk in the middle. Really cute little herb garden. And yet another example of a circle herb garden. This using bricks to form the circle, the outer circle. Very easy to do. I did it. And you just buy some cement if you want to do mortar in between the bricks. A really simple, I did mine in a day, and I am not handy. So that means anybody can do it. And again, you have the different pie-shaped areas, each growing its own different herb. So circle herb gardens are really a nice way to add interest to your garden. Here's just an example of somebody who just decided I know on my water needs, I'm going to grow a bunch of different types of basil all in one container. They threw in what I think is either a summer savory or a winter savory for interest, but really nice. And then there's something kind of new to the around here is a spiral herb garden. It's a way to maximize your space. You can use different materials to do it, limestone, brick. And the idea, I'm going to show a picture next, you spire up, you maximize your space. The most drought tolerant herb goes on the top because that's where it's going to be the driest. And then the water will go down. So the herbs that need the most water will be on the bottom. So here's one example of a spiral herb garden. It takes up as much or as little room as you want. It's highly customizable. Here's another one showing the construction of an herb garden, a spiral herb garden. If you're interested, if you go on the internet and just Google spiral herb garden, you'll get all sorts of ideas. But here, as they build it up, they add the dirt soil as they go. And you see she's just sort of compacting in the bricks, the pavers there as she goes up. And so here's that in progress, and here's that finished herb garden. So this is much bigger, and they're really using it also for some lettuces here as well. But you can see that's a rosemary on top, so they're using the most drought tolerant on the top, and the lettuces I think there's chard in there that need the most water on that bottom level. Just a couple more examples of spiral herb gardens. This one, they didn't put anything in between, so this is probably the easiest to make. Here, I think they have some marigolds on the bottom. And again, on the top is where they've put the most drought-tolerant plants. And just another one. Here's, we were talking about German chamomile before. That's an annual, would need a slightly more water. And here they've got those white flowers that are cascading off in the front. That's a beautiful example of some German chamomile in their spiral herb garden. So what other ways do we have to use our herbs? We've got that edging and ground covers. Certain herbs do really well for this. Great edging plant. Here's an example of what I think is an English lavender, uses edging for a front garden. You can't say that, but this is just, this is a sidewalk on the bottom right. Thyme also makes great edging. Here's an example of just, I was just on my walk and I saw somebody use a thyme plant right in front of their mailbox. And I thought it was a great use. It's a little shady, which explains why it's a little leggy, but still, I like it. And rosemary. There's a rosemary for every occasion. These are used basically as a hedge, although these are the lower growing rosemaries. So when you buy a rosemary, be careful. Look at what it says on the tag of how high they're going to grow, because some rosemaries can grow quite large. There's certain thymes make great ground covers. Woolly thyme is a little more gray, and then elfin thyme, which is what you see here, are two varieties that make really nice ground covers. Here's an example of elfin thyme between pavers. I have something similar in my yard, and the only thing I would say is you do have to make sure that you weed. It's not a weed-free thing, but it makes a really nice growth between pavers. And it can take a bit of foot traffic, not much, but a little bit. And then here's an example of the woolly thyme. See if you can tell, it's slightly more gray, and it will not flower as much between pavers. And then we've got the containers, which is, like I said, they do well in containers. So just to give you some ideas here, here we have one herb per container, which if you're really going to use them for culinary purposes or crafting, this might be the way to go. I don't have a picture of it, but herbs are also great fillers if you want other, if you're using annuals or maybe a large grass. Thyme especially makes a great edging plant in a larger container. Here's an example of grouping your herbs but this pot's a little small to group 3 herbs, but it'll do for a while. The good thing about it is they've grouped like water needs together. So they've got a purple basil, what's a parsley, could be a cilantro. Those leaves look very similar. And then a lettuce. So not an herb, but also needs the same amount of water as the other two. So think about those good combinations of their water needs. Now here's an example of a combination I am really hesitant. I would never do this. So they've got a basil that needs a lot of water. They have in the back, I'm pretty sure that's a chive. That would be okay, those two maybe. But then that's a mint on the right and a rosemary on the bottom of your screen. Those two are going to compete with each other and completely take over those poor basil and chives. So if you're doing this just, for a summer, you just like it, yeah, do that. But then immediately take that rosemary out and put that mint in its own pot. It's an invasive thing. It'll take over. So you really want to be careful of your combination of plants when you're putting it in a container. One thing I do, so here's an example, rosemary, basil, and thyme. So not a great example of water-wise, but I saw this at a garden center. It was a really good price because what I could do is after I enjoyed it either on a windowsill inside for a while, I just took them all out and I planted them outside separately, either in container or in the ground. So buying herbs in groups is sometimes a deal, but they will outgrow their pots soon. So be prepared to transplant if you're buying it like this. Then we talked about mint, but what do we do with that mint? You really want mint, or you really want that catnip or lemon balm or any of those herbs that are in the mint family? How do we prevent them? Put them in their own pot. I'm going to back up for a while because how do you tell if something is in a mint family? It's actually pretty easy. If you look at the leaf and it's actually square, and it's not, the stem, it's squarish, it's not round, then you might have something in the mint family. Chocolate mint, this is where I wish we were doing it in person so I could share the smell with you, that this scent of the chocolate mint is just amazing. Find it and put it in its own pot. You can grow it in the ground, maybe unless you have a dedicated spot where what's going to happen is the roots go underground and then they come up somewhere you weren't expecting. That's what a mint is going to do. So if you plant a big pot, at least 18 inches down with a lip, then you're going to be able to contain that mint, or at least as it escapes, you can control it more. Terracotta, beautiful idea, but it might not last very long. You can see it's already cracked, and that mint is just one more year and it's going to escape. And then you're going to have a mint yard, and your neighbor is going to have a mint yard, and their neighbor is going to have a mint yard. I've done this. I've done it in a 5-gallon container, the paint bucket that you can buy in the store, or maybe you have some in your garage. I've used black. It just blends in a little more, but white soon enough, this will be covered by the mint leaves and you will not see it. Make sure to add drainage holes if you do this, and leave a lip above the soil, or as I say, it's going to escape really fast. But I've done it where I've had 3 or 4 different types of mints next to each other like this, and it's really pretty once it covers the gallon pot. Now here, this is my yard. I've put in a lemon balm in its own pot. It won't overrun the other plants in the garden this way. And then I've also, you can't see, but I've put a flagstone underneath, and that's going to prevent the root from escaping, or at least it's going to slow it down. Eventually, they want to find a way out of there, but it will slow it down. If you're an eagle eye, you'll see that I actually planted a little thyme there. Bad combination, I was just telling you. But what I had done is I had bought a 6-pack of thyme. I didn't have room for this 6th thyme, but I didn't want to throw it away because it's a plant and I didn't have anybody to give it to. So I'm sticking it in here for now until I find room for it. So that's what that's doing there. here are a couple of resources if you want to just jot it down. If you really just Google UCANR and then herbs or culinary herbs, landscaping with herbs, you'll find these two PDFs and they'll give you some more information. I'm just going to leave this up for just a few seconds if you want to jot down the ideas. But again, just if you Google culinary herb profile and UCANR, which is University of California, you'll get to these good PDFs. Well, I hope that I've gotten you inspired. And if there are any questions, Laura, maybe you have some to ask.
Well, I tell you, what a wonderful presentation, and you were so thorough on covering everything. Thank you. I've never really myself grown with herbs, but you made me enthusiastic about it. I hope everyone else was as inspired today.
Good.
One of the questions someone had is outside of just kind of cooking, are particular herb plants fragrant? Can you plant some just to have that nice smell? Maybe you're sitting in your backyard.
Yeah, so if you plant in large enough groups, you might be able to smell without doing anything with the plant. But the most common example for that, where I was going to go with that, is most of the times if you're like going to brush up against it, you just brush up against it, and is there something that's going to waft? Lavender, which I'm picturing right here, is the best example of that. You don't have to do much besides just kind of run your hand against it, or maybe you've just brushed up against it when you're walking, and you'll get that scent. So that's the one that comes immediately to mind. But then there's definitely others. Trying to think of ones that would not work that way. Nasturtium, great, but it wouldn't work that way. Bee balm, if you were to plant that, that's similar to where you just have to kind of brush your hand and you get that scent going. But lavenders, if you're really looking for that, and there's so many different types of lavenders and they all have slightly different scents, that would be my recommendation.
Got some really good questions here. A couple regarding basil, one on propagating basil, and also how tolerant is basil outside in our wonderful Fresno summer sun?
So I'll answer that the second one first, because I have a bunch of basil that they don't always do well in my garden, but this year they have taken off. I have put it in a place where it will not get the worst of the sun, which to me right now is going to be like after 4 p.m., after 3 p.m. So it's in more shaded area in the afternoon. It gets completely full sun though in the morning through about 2 or 3 o'clock. So yeah, definitely basil is fine in our summer. And the tip there for basil, a few things. I think I might have mentioned this earlier. If you're growing basil to use like for pesto or other cooking, and you think you might want to go through a lot of it through the whole summer, snip it. You can take a pretty large, it'll get pretty large. Take, about, I don't know, maybe I'm looking 5 inches, 6 inches, and right above a pair of leaves, cut that off and use that. And that'll give enough for your basil plant to get flush with leaves again. You want to make sure that you leave enough of the basil plant there that there's enough leaves on that plant to grow again. Do snip off the flowers though. That's going to prevent too much more leaves from growing. So just snip off the flowers as they grow. As far as propagating, I think that's what you were asking. Did you mean propagating from seed or just dividing? I'm going to answer the dividing part because there's a tip here. You can't really divide because it's an annual. But when I was telling you how I put a jar of basil on the counter to use, if you do that same thing and just wait, it's going to root. And that's how you get more basil plants. At least that's worked for me. So that's the easiest way I would suggest to propagate. Just try, see what happens. But really, if I didn't use the basil plant and suddenly I looked at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's rooting. Let me try to plant it. And I did. And there I had another basil plant.
That's a
So,
win-win
yep.
situation there.
Yep.
Have some very pest-related questions.
Okay.
Let's see. They were kind of related. One is something ate my cilantro and basil. What can I
Mhm.
do? And the other one is I have rosemary bushes in my front yard, but they can't get rid of spittle bugs. So it looks like maybe is there particular pests that really like those herbs, and maybe what we can do to get rid of those bugs, but save those herbs.
Yeah. And sometimes the answer is going to be, well, we just plant more than we need. And then we let those, whatever that is eating the parsley and cilantro, we let them be, because you don't want to really spray your herbs with pests. I mean, you can, but you're eating those leaves. The whole idea is to eat the leaves. So you want to be careful. I would suggest what you put on those leaves if you're trying to get rid of a pest. I would not, I personally, I would not do that. Um, Let me answer. In general, herbs are very pest free in general. But the two examples that you mentioned, the parsley and cilantro, you'll see that those are biennial and annuals. So those are the ones that I wouldn't be surprised. It might have been a small caterpillar. It's hard to know without looking at it. There's a lot of bugs that might say, that looks very tasty. And I'm going to try that, and I'm going to shred it. And all you're going to see when you come out is a stem. And I'm just like, oh, it happens. But unfortunately, unless there's evidence of what that was, it's really hard to tell. But, I wouldn't have been surprised if maybe that was a caterpillar of some kind, and they're all just a bunch of those out there. You might want to try, if you put that parsley or cilantro away from wherever that was, maybe you can put it in a container on your patio if you have a patio, and that might keep those pests away. Caterpillars aren't going to grow that far, right? So if it was a caterpillar, just try a different area. These spittle bugs, I am not a pest person. You might want to just try, I hesitate to say this during a drought, spraying it down with water first. Again, if you're using those herbs for culinary purposes, I'd be very careful, especially about what you want to put. We're going to have a slide in just a little bit that's going to talk about our helpline. And that's where you're going to want to, if you have a picture of that, you can email that to them with the photo, and they're going to answer you. And they have a pretty quick turnaround in answering. So when we get to that, Roz is going to talk to you about when you have very specific questions, and they're much better than I am on the fly of answering those pest questions.
Your website and reference and help is awesome. I really highly recommend people that this is a great resource, and they are great about getting back to you about all kinds of questions. To take maybe one more question, which I thought was interesting, is should you mulch your potted plants?
Oh, so that's funny. I normally don't, but the main reason I don't even think of it is that my potted plants are pretty full. I don't need to mulch because they're basically have a living mulch there. A lot of people, that's what they call that. The whole area is taken up already with plant matter. But if they're not, that's not a bad idea, because the whole idea in that scenario, the idea is to keep that moisture in. You certainly wouldn't need to do like a 3-inch mulch though. The idea there is cover the bare soil. The main thing, and I have to say, we in Fresno, we love our bare soil. I don't know why we do, but we do. So, but you want to cover that bare soil, and a little bit of herbs in a pot, putting just a little bit of mulch might help keep that, help you not have to water quite as often. Now, herbs in a pot, we didn't talk about this. Herbs in a pot, just like any other container, make sure, don't water till it's dry, but containers clearly are going to get drier faster than something in the landscape. So you may have to plant water every other day, sometimes in the heat every day, but it's not going to need very much water. Don't water till it's like gushing out the bottom. Water till it's just a little bit is coming out the bottom, and then you don't need to water anymore. But yeah, that mulch, especially, I would say, especially if it's in a sunny part of your garden, that mulch could help.
Wonderful. We'll give one more question here, and then Roz is going to follow up with some really great info.
Yep.
Is Maureen said, I have a milky white liquid on my mint. Any ideas and suggestions?
Well, that is, and this is where I say I do not know my pests. That's a really common thing, and I bet Roz knows what that is. She can jump in when we get to her. I think that's one of those spittle bugs, if I'm not wrong. It's probably not going to harm your mint at all. It's just some life cycle of some insect. If there's a lot, if it's taking over, then you have an infestation. But if you're just talking a couple of stems, I'm a big fan of live and let live, unless it's really eating your stuff, like we were talking about with the parsley and cilantro earlier. If it's bothering you, if there's a lot, the first thing I would do is just use water to wash it off and see if it comes back. But that's another great one, especially if you have had a picture of it, to show the helpline, which we're going to have a slide. Roz is going to show a slide for that. I wish I could answer that better.
Well, Anne, this has been outstanding program today. Thank you so much. And passing on also the thanks from our many listeners, I'm going to ask Roz to give us some more information.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Oh, and you know what? I can't switch it because it's on your, okay, and I can't hear you either.
I will switch for you.
Okay. So a couple of things that I just wanted to share, and Anne, thank you for a really wonderful presentation. Even though I've seen it before, I learn more each time I watch it. But you did mention, growing some of your herbs by seed. And I just wanted to say I've been very successful with growing basil in those plastic containers you get from takeout, the ones that have a lid. They don't need to be very deep, and you can put your soil right in there, sprinkle your basil seeds on top. And I've actually done that twice this year, and I have an incredible plantings of basil. But the other thing I wanted to share was basil can be frozen. And if you decide to do that, when you have an abundance of it, snip off the leaves, wash them, use a spinner if you have it, but if not, just paper dry the leaves and add them to a freezer bag, and you'll have basil all winter long that will taste really fresh. And I use that in a lot of my spaghetti sauces.
Yeah, that's a great, Roz, I'm gonna jump in because I was gonna add this slide and it was too late about freezing. You can also freeze that in water, like in an ice cube. You'd want to chop it up first. So and you can do this with cilantro too. There's some herbs that work really well with freezing in water. So next time we do this, I'll add a little thing on that freezing, because that's a great idea.
Now, one other herb that I tried growing from seed was thyme. And thyme seems to be encapsulated. And I swear it took like 3 weeks for it to grow. And it's been pretty slow growing. But you can do that from seed also. Yeah. And then regarding caterpillars, I do use BT. I use BT on both my tomatoes and my basil, as well as some other plants like petunias that get those little tiny caterpillars. But they do enough damage to damage your flowers and or your leaves. So that would be something that's a fairly safe, not pesticide, but
well, it is, yeah, but you're right, it's very safe. Yeah.
So if you can switch to the next slide. So I wanted to share with you some of the upcoming classes that we have. The next one will be next Saturday. It's another Zoom class, and there are 3 or 4 Master Gardener that we call tomato gurus, that are going to be there to first give a short presentation on tomatoes, and then there'll be questions and answers. So any questions or concerns that you have about growing tomatoes, next week's Zoom will be great for that. And then the week after, July 23rd at Sunnyside Library, Gwen Olshev will be doing cool season veggies, how to plant them and have them through the fall and winter. And then we've been working on our fall lineup of classes. And the first one on September 10th is with Sharon Matson. That will be a class at the Woodward Park Library, cooking with edible flowers, which uses a lot of the herbs. September 17th at the Garden of the Sun, there'll be irrigation in the home garden. On October 1st, I'll be doing an actual make it, take it class on how to do a succulent pumpkin. There will be a fee of $40, and that will be at the Garden of the Sun. On October 15th will be an in-person class on native plants with Carol Giovacchini at the Woodward Park Library. And what you were talking about earlier, the magic of mulch, Tim Sullivan is going to be doing a Zoom presentation on that. And that is very, very interesting. It's all the things that you can use from your garden or from your landscape to create mulch. And then on October 29th, we'll be doing a mini pumpkins for kids. They'll be decorating mini pumpkins, and there will be a fee of $15 for that class. None of the fall classes you're able to register for, but if you come back in August, you can register for those classes. And again, for the Zoom class next week, you can go to this registration, fresnolibrary.libcal.com. And if you can go on to the next slide. If you're interested in becoming a Master Gardener, the next training class is in 2023. It's a 16-week course from January through April. There's a tuition fee of $250, and there are partial scholarships available. The applications are available now, but they're due by August 31st. There'll be interviews in September, the selection in October, and the application is on the Master Gardener website. And if you can switch to the next slide. If you have any of those gardening questions that we weren't able to answer today, if you want to take a photograph of this slide, it has where the helpline is, mgfresno@ucdavis.ecu, or you can visit our website. And if you want to get on our mailing list, the bottom slide or the bottom link will take you there. So Ann, I want to thank you again for a wonderful presentation. And Laura, I want to thank you too for hosting our Zoom classes. I'm hoping that the public really enjoys this. And if you have comments that you want to share with us on the helpline, that's great. And let us know if there's classes that you're interested in having us find speakers for, because we do have a lot of talented Master Gardeners that enjoy teaching classes. So, Ann, thank you. Laura, thank you.
And thank you, the Fresno Master Gardeners pearls of wisdom that I love writing down. Just a reminder to everyone that we are recording the Zoom program. It'll probably take a week, maybe 2 weeks to get it up on the Fresno Library YouTube website, as well as the Master Gardener website. If you go to fresnolibrary.org and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see that tiny kind of little YouTube icon. It'll kind of take you directly. So if you're looking also for previous programs, all the Zooms are recorded and put up on these websites. Thank you again, both of you, for an outstanding program. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. Laura,
can I just add two things? I went back through the question and answers.
Yes.
BT is Bacillus thuringiensis, and you can find that in most of the big box stores or the nurseries. And secondly, when I freeze my basil, I always wash off all the leaves. There's so much dust in Fresno, and that spinner, I couldn't believe how, your salad spinner. I decided to use that for the first time instead of doing it in paper towels. And in like a couple of spins, you're ready to put it into those freezer bags. So hopefully that answers everyone's questions. And again, Laura and Ann, thank you so much for doing these classes.
All right. Thank you. And we'll see you all in the future.
See you next week.
All righty. Take care, everybody.